How much weight for power training? Today you will learn how much weight should you use for your power training, the different types of power training and how much weight for power training for these power training types you need to use, different power training exercises, and a discussion why what you usually read about power training is not the full truth. How much weight for power training? How much weight should you use for your power training? First and foremost, let's define what power training is. I've outlined in previous videos power, the physical formula of power. Power equals force times distance divided by time. And then if we flip that formula around, because distance divided by time is velocity, we can say power is force multiplied by velocity. So as opposed to strength training, which mainly focuses on the force development and overcoming resistance, power training focuses on overcoming resistance as well, but as fast as possible. So there's also velocity in the equation, which means you don't only want to lift, you want to lift as fast as possible. In very simple word, you want to maximize velocity, and that can be done best with a variety and range of weights. How do you do that? How do you know how much weight you should use for your power training? Well, as I've outlined, you usually use a range of loads, and I'll come to that in a minute. The most common way to determine how much weight you use is using percentages of your 1RM. So you know the weight you can lift for one repetition in a given exercise, and then use certain percentages of that weight to determine how much weight you should use for your power training. But it can also be done by calculating or measuring the velocity. So there are devices that can measure the velocity of the movement. So these are the two options. Percentage of 1RM or measuring velocity, and you have a quality control whether you are in the right power training zone or not. What are different types of power training? For the different types of power training, I use some classification where I distinguish between different efforts. So a plyometric effort, which usually involves the stretch shortening cycle, so that can either be a short stretch shortening cycle or a long stretch shortening cycle. A ballistic effort, where the weight or the object goes into a free flight. And a dynamic effort, which is usually done with added bands or chains to minimize the deceleration and the braking phase. The reason for that is that in most exercises, the deceleration or braking phase, stops to occur. Well, whether that is a good explanation, I don't know. Well, after 80 to 85% of your 1RM, there's no deceleration or braking anymore. Which means that if you're training at percentages below 85 or 80, there's always a deceleration phase, which is not a good thing if you want to develop power by maximizing velocity. So if you have to brake and decelerate, you won't be able to maximize velocity. So long explanation, how much weight should you use for your power training? That was the initial question. Let's go through the different efforts, the percentages, and how much weight that is if you would calculate it. The plyometric effort, you work with percentages of 0 to 20% of your 1RM, which means if we take the example of a back squat and you can back squat 100 kilos, you work either with your body weight or 20 kilos additional load. The movement velocity, if you would measure it in meters per second, the movement velocity usually is above 2.5 meters per second. With these velocities, we need to be a bit careful because that depends very much on whether it's an advanced athlete or a beginner athlete, big differences, or the type of exercises. So lower body, upper body is very different in terms of movement velocity. For the ballistic effort, we work with intensities of 20 to 50% of the 1RM. So again, the back squat with 100 kilos, 1RM, 20 to 50 kilos additional load, and then ballistically, so squatting, jumping, loaded jumps. Movement velocity usually tend to be between 2.5 meters per second to 0.9 meters per second. For the dynamic effort, we use intensities of 50 to 70% 1RM. Again, coming back to the back squat, 50 kilos to 70 kilos, plus bands, for example, and movement velocities tend to be between 0.9 to 0.5 meters per second. Which load should you use for your power training? Again, that depends very much on what your goal is. If you want to improve power at higher velocities, you need to choose loads at the lower end of the spectrum, so somewhere between 0 to 30% 1RMs, 0 to maximum 50% 1RM. Conversely, if you want to improve power against higher resistances, you need to choose loads at the higher end of the spectrum, somewhere 50 to 70, maximum 80% of the 1RM. Let's talk about power training exercises and which power training exercises to use. Because for the different efforts, not all exercises are created equal. So for each effort, you need to choose a certain type of exercise. Which power training exercises are that? Let's go through it step by step. For the plyometric effort, again, lower loads, 0 to 20% 1RM. You choose exercises like unloaded jumps with your body weight. That can be counter movement jumps, hurdle jumps, box jumps, drop jumps, whatever it might be. Or light, very light implements for the upper body, light medicine balls, for example. Appropriate exercises for the ballistic effort. You choose loaded jumps, for example. You can use dumbbells as an external load, barbells. And you choose heavier implements for the upper body, so heavier medicine balls. We can also think about a bench throw in the Smith machine, as well as the use of cables and resistance bands. Okay, for the dynamic effort, what type of power training exercises are you using for that? Well, these are your big lifts with bands attached, chains attached, whatever it might be. Big lift refers to squatting, pressing movements, bench press, shoulder press, and also the pulls from the ground or rowing variations. That means heavier implements, barbells most of the times, and bands attached. I think I just outlined that a second ago. And also the Olympic lifts and variations of the Olympic lifts. Most of the times, if you work at the percentages I've outlined before, 50 to 70%, maximum of 80%, you tend to use variations from the blocks or from the hang. So you shorten the range in order to minimize the braking and deceleration. What does that mean? Well, if you think of 50% of your 1RM power clean from the ground and you pull it and maximize velocity, the weight will probably fly above your head. In order to avoid that, you work with the shorter range from the mid-thigh, from the hip, so you can apply maximum velocity and maximum acceleration without having a braking or deceleration. To wrap it up, how much weight for power training? Well, first and foremost, definition of power or power training. Power is force multiplied by velocity, which means as opposed to strength training, you want to maximize not only the weight on the bar, you want to maximize the velocity. Power training can be categorized in different efforts ranging from 0% to 70, maximum of 80%. And each effort has a certain movement velocity and an appropriate exercise selection for that effort. So now it's up to you. I would like to know, how have you done your power training so far? So please leave me a comment below and let me know what you have done as power training so far and how it has worked for you. And if there are any questions unanswered from my outline.